The abolitionist Riposte, the impact of the slave trade. The image of Dahomey as a militaristic and despotic monarchy, given to the practice of human sacrifice on an extravagant scale, is therefore difficult to avoid. It was not, in fact, normally rejected even by the abolitionists of the 18th century and though John Atkins, who defended the Dahomeys against the charge of cannibalism as well as attributing humanitarian motives to their wars of conquest, is an exception. The issue for most of the abolitionists was rather, how, and why, had Dahomey come to be the sort of society which it was? Snellgrave had claimed that the cycle of warfare, captivity and sacrifice had existed in Africa since time out of mind. The abolitionists sought to argue rather that the militarization of societies such as Dahomey was a new phenomenon, which was itself a consequence of the slave trade. On this hypothesis, of course, the brutality of Dahomey society served to reinforce rather than to undermine the moral case against the slave trade. The argument that the European demand for slaves was itself a cause of wars in Africa is already implicit in the work of John Atkins in 1735, though, as has been seen, he applied this interpretation to the cases of Allada and Wydah rather than to Dahomey. It was made more explicit, and given a clearer historical form, by William Smith, 1744, who observed, apparently with specific reference to the Gold Coast, that the discerning natives account it their greatest unhappiness, that they were ever visited by the Europeans. They say that we Christians introduced the traffic of slaves, and that before our coming they lived in peace. The argument was elaborated by the American abolitionist Anthony Benezet, in a work published originally in 1771. Benezet claimed that Smith's remark is supported by a study of early European accounts of Africa, which show that the Africans then generally lived in peace amongst themselves, for I do not find, in the numerous publications I have perused on the subject, of there being wars on that coast, nor of any scale of captives taken in battle, who would have been otherwise sacrificed by the victors. The subsequent prevalence of war, Benezet inferred, was due to the slave trade, the Africans having become corrupted by their intercourse with the Europeans and incited by warfare by drunkenness and avarice. The claim that African wars were caused by the European market for slaves thereafter became a commonplace of abolitionist polemic, and the argument was soon applied to the specific case of Dahomey. Thus Forbes, in 1851 was in no doubt that his description of Dahomey served to illustrate the dreadful slave hunts and ravages, the annihilations and exterminations, consequent on the slave trade. These wars are directly and instrumentally the acts of the slave merchants at Wydah and its neighboring ports. Although not originally worked out with reference to the case of Dahomey, this abolitionist argument clearly worried the anti-abolitionist historians of Dahomey, Norris and Dalzell. Norris insisted that according to his reading of the records, Africa had always been like this. That the wars which have always existed in Africa have no connection with the slave trade, is evident from the universality of the practice of it between communities in a savage state. The oldest writers, as Leo, and others, have represented the Africans as living in a continual state of war and rapine, long before the commerce with Europeans was introduced among them. Dalzell suggested that the history of Dahomey itself, which waged continuous warfare during a period of time, after the 1720s, declining slave exported, refuted the view that African wars were stimulated by the slave trade. He also reports that Lionel Abson had put the issue to the king of Dahomey, Pangla, the successor of Tigbisu, himself, and that the monarch had obligingly declared, "In the name of my ancestors and myself I aver that no Dahomey man ever embarked in war merely for the sake of procuring wherewithal to purchase your commodities. Wegbija fought and conquered all his neighbors. Did Wegbija sell slaves? No, his prisoners were killed to a man." There was an obvious difficulty in this interpretation, that Dahomey was clearly more militarized than the kingdoms of Allada and Wydah which preceded it in the coastal area. Dalzell acknowledged, for example, that human sacrifices had been seldom and inconsiderable in Wydah, by comparison with Dahomey. This might seem to suggest that militarism was indeed a recent rather than an ancient feature of African societies, but Norris was ready with an ingenious explanation. Dahomey, he suggested, had already been the same, in the interior, beyond the knowledge of the Europeans, until its conquest of the coast in the 1720s. Isolated from the civilizing influence of trade with Europe, the Dahomeyans had preserved the archaic character once common throughout Africa. It was not that the Dahomeyans, under the influence of the slave trade, had become more militaristic, rather it was Allada and Wydah which had, through their involvement in the Atlantic trade, declined from their ancient ferocity of temper, grown voluptuous and effeminate, and lost every spark of their martial fire, thus leaving them an easy prey to the more conservative Dahomeyans. Among recent historians, the abolitionist picture of an originally peaceful society corrupted into violence by the European slave trade has exercised considerable influence. It was, for example, adopted and elaborated by W.E.B. Du Bois in his pioneering study of Negro history published in 1915. Du Bois asserted that the evidence showed the supersession in West Africa of early coastal cultures characterized by city democracy and developed craft industries, by despotic militaristic empires such as Dahomey, and also Assant. His picture of Dahomey is wholly negative and as a fierce and bloody tyranny with wholesale murder. Dahomey was the last word in a series of human disasters. The origins of the change are attributed unequivocally to the slave trade, and to the warfare which it encouraged. From Du Bois, as well as directly from the earlier abolitionist sources, the view that Dahomey's despotic and militarized character was a consequence of its involvements in the slave trade was transmitted to later historians, including especially Basil Davidson, 1961. For historians such as Du Bois and Davidson, seeking to project a more sympathetic picture of pre-colonial African societies, part of the attraction of this interpretation was clearly that it served to externalize in some degree the responsibility for many of the unattractive features which they found in these societies. The alternative anti-abolitionist view denying the commercial origins of Dahomey's wars has also, however, persisted. Karl Polanyi's insistence on the irrelevance of the profit motive in the determination of Dahomey policy, for example, clearly owes a great deal to 18th century anti-abolitionist sources such as Dalzell. More explicitly, writers such as Fage, 1969, and Roman, 1971 have drawn upon the anti-abolitionist interpretation of Dahomey, including in particular Lionel Abson's Riposte of King Pengla's pronouncement on the issue, to deny that African wars can be explained wholly, or even mainly, in terms of the slave trade. Somewhat paradoxically, for these writers this alternative view also serves to vindicate the dignity of African societies, since the denial that their history can be understood in terms of the impact of the European trade supports a claim for the essentially autonomous character of their historical development, which is explained in terms of internal dynamics rather than of external influences. In this controversy, the balance of the evidence clearly favors the abolitionist view. Dahomey itself was, after all, a new state, founded according to Norris in around 1625 and no evidence available either in the 18th century or subsequently suggest that it had been preceded by any similar states in the same area. It is difficult, therefore, convincingly to present Dahomeyan militarism as a survival from primitive antiquity. More generally, whatever may be true of the rest of Africa, evidence from the slave coast does seem to bear out the abolitionist view of an increasing, rather than a diminishing scale of warfare. Although the earliest accounts of the area do of course allude to wars, the sources offer a clear enough impression that by the 1690s the scale and frequency of wars on the slave coast was significantly greater than earlier. One especially interesting feature of the wars of this period was the increasing resort, by both Allada and Wydah, to the hiring of mercenary soldiers, recruited especially from the Gold Coast to the west. This use of Gold Coast mercenaries on the slave coast may in fact have been pioneered by the Europeans, since the earliest recorded instance appears to have been by the Dutch, in a local dispute at Afra, the port of Allada, in 1687. The anti-abolitionists cited this use of mercenaries as evidence of the decline in martial spirit of the coastal peoples, but the commercialization of warfare which it implies seems itself a significant new phenomenon. The rise of Dahomey in the interior was clearly only a part of a wider process of increasing warfare, and of the increasing professionalization of warfare, in the slave coast area. Given the coincidence in time between this process of militarization and the growth of the Atlantic slave trade, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that the two developments are in some way linked. Dahomey itself, as has been seen, was known, as the coast, as source of slaves by the 1680s, and its military organization was geared towards the collection of slaves, soldiers being obliged to surrender all their captives, as well as the heads of slain enemies, to the king in return for a money payment. The fact that the king paid 4 times as much for a live captive as for a head created an incentive for the capture rather than the killing of enemies. Dalzell, it is true, claimed that, since many of those captured were sacrificed, slave gathering could not have been a source of profit to the king, but the statistics do not support him.